Welcome to Framing the Issues. This is CDP 402, and this material covers Chapter 1 in your primary text, which is the Babor text. So our chapter starts off with identifying some important definitions that will be used throughout the rest of the book and the course. In the news, you probably heard that we're in a drug epidemic, and what does that mean? Well, the definition is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time, as opposed to something that is endemic, which is regular and widespread consumption, usually attributed to a specific group of people or a certain area. Our working definition for psychoactive drugs will be a substance capable of influencing the brain systems linked to reward and pleasure. And when we talk about drug use, we're talking about taking psychoactive substances. So throughout the text, we'll be looking at use, abuse, and problematic use. Okay, continued. Drug misuse, harmful use, problematic drug use. This is a critical distinction, which is the point at which psychoactive substances cause problems for the user or for society. The point at which psychoactive substances cause problems for the user or for society. This is an important distinction to make because the majority of drug users use drugs without a lot of negative consequences. And it's about 10% of the population that has an issue with it, severe enough to warrant treatment. And only a very small amount of that 10% actually make it to treatment. So a person, and this could be controversial, a person that uses drugs doesn't necessarily have a problem with drugs. They can use them without having negative consequences. Okay. But what we see, we don't see people in treatment that don't need treatment in general. Very, very, very rare. I've had it happen once, actually, that I can recall. When we talk about addiction, when we talk about drug laws, we're looking at this part of the population, which is a smaller part of the population for which drug use is really, really problematic. But the small percentage of people, the aftermath of drug use is huge. Financial costs, health costs, government costs, public health costs, and of course the ultimate cost of life. Drug dependence, for the purposes of this text, a psychobiological syndrome characterized by impaired control of drug use and acquired ability to tolerate large amounts of the drug, continued drug use in the presence of adverse personal consequences, and the experience of withdrawal symptoms when the drug use is stopped. Okay. In the DSM-5, we have switched from abuse and dependence to substance use disorder, and it's a spectrum. There are two substances for which a person can become physically dependent to the point where if they were to cold turkey it, they could potentially die, and that's benzodiazepines and alcohol, where the tissues can become physically dependent upon those substances. Okay. For the purposes of this text, this is the definition that they're using. And they do mention that things have changed. However, it is important to note that this is an English publication from Oxford Press. So some of the spelling is going to be different. They largely focus on drug policy in the United States, which is why this text was selected. However, you will notice some British language throughout the book. The definition of drug-related problems: the social, legal, psychological, and medical consequences frequently associated with the use of psychoactive substances. So we're looking at this from a micro, the user perspective, meso, community, and macro, a global or policy perspective. Drug policy are the laws and policies intended to influence whether or not individuals decide to use psychoactive substances and to affect the consequences of use for both the individual and the community. Okay. Why does policy matter? Policies may have serious unintended consequences that can be as serious as the problems they are designed to solve. Oftentimes we'll have something traumatic happen and there's a knee-jerk policy reaction, and the pendulum swings too far in one direction or in the other direction. And so what often happens, and we'll discuss this later on, Policy, especially policy that's designed to restrict supply, does not call demand. And when the supply is all of a sudden shut off, we have demand that still exists, becomes more desperate, and drives behaviors underground and into riskier situations. So we have to look at all of the unintended consequences when looking at policy. What could seem like a good idea in theory could have disastrous consequences in practice. Governments and societies struggle to manage these consequences and the consequences of substances that might have medicinal merit, for example, marijuana, but could have negative consequences for the user and society. So some of the policy issues that we're going to be looking at are drug-related violence, decriminalization and drug tourism, smuggling, petty crime, the war on drugs, and mass incarceration. And one of the first things that you'll be doing in our week of classes here is watching a documentary on the war on drugs called The Last White Hope, which is going to highlight the drug war in the United States. Another issue directly stemmed from drug policy is the mass incarceration, particularly mandatory minimum sentencing for drug crimes. Okay. Now, all is not lost. There are many countries that have successful programming, and the United States does have some successful programming as well. In Sweden, the government controls and shifting public perception led to an abatement of the crisis, which is great. So one of the things that's important to look at is not every solution is going to work for every place because every place is very different. In France, they've used harm reduction via MATs, medication-assisted treatment, things like Suboxone, Vivitrol, Methadone. And then USA, we've been very successful in controlling drug precursors such as methamphetamine. Here is an example. In the early 2000s, 1 in 4 people tested positive for methamphetamine at Portland Jail, the downtown Portland Jail in Oregon. And what they did was you had to eventually get a prescription for Sudafed, which is a precursor to making meth. And nobody should be buying 10 cases of Sudafed. That's not reasonable. That would automatically flag a person. If you go to buy Sudafed today in Washington State, you have to show your license. And usually it's about 2 or 3. You can buy 2 or 3 packages at a time, and then it's going to be flagged. And so they will enter your license information into the computer. So then if you were to go to different pharmacies and buy 2 or 3 packs a day at the different pharmacies, you would be flagged. Okay. So when they did this in Oregon, meth labs decreased by about 90%, and that was in the early 2000s. We're going to look in depth at Portugal later on this semester. They decriminalized everything, and what happened was they had less HIV, less incarceration, and more productivity because they largely focused on vocational and educational programs for people that were suffering from addiction and in and out of jail. So we want to talk about the balance of negative things, knee-jerk reaction policy, and then what is actually working and why is it working. Okay. So looking at the governance of drug laws. Drug laws and policy regulate the possession, so whether or not you can have it, use, distribution, how it's distributed. Is it through pharmacy? Is it over the counter? Is it asked the pharmacist only? Is it prescription? Can you grow your own, etc.? And production of substances and set penalties for violations. Drug laws regulate programs to prevent the initiation of drug use by non-users. So intervention programs, prevention, education, early intervention, treatment, rehabilitation, and social service programs intended to help heavy drug users change their behavior or reduce the consequences of their drug use. So here we have harm reduction, reduce the consequences of their drug use. And then laws, regulations, and initiatives to control the supply of illegal drugs, as well as the supply of diverted prescription drugs used for non-medical purposes. So diversion, an example would be if you have a medical professional working at a hospital and they're stealing medication either for themselves or selling it. So diverted meaning that it's not going to the intended place. Okay. Usually not for medical purposes. Where is policy? So when you hear drug policy or the word policy, you might think that it's very boring or one-dimensional or just at the state or city level, and that doesn't affect us, but it does, and you see policy and examples of it every day. So we have policy and programming in our schools, like the DARE program, McGruff the Crime Dog, Drug Court, the Drug-Free School Zone, all of those programs and commercials that you might remember growing up in our communities, in our healthcare setting, with police, and with border control. Okay, so the Babor book, the chapters are relatively short, and so each week you will have some supplemental material. This week you have a couple films to watch and a couple things to read in regards to an introduction of drug policy. I hope that we have a lot of fun this semester. Policy doesn't have to be boring, and each week you will be turning in a current event, and current meaning in the past 3 to 5 years or so, because policy can take a while to come down the pipeline. And we're going to learn and grow together. And the current events are always fun because we always tend to pick different things. And so each week you'll upload your current event in the forum section and we'll learn about what's going on. All right, have a great week.